Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this lecture at the Royal Society of Edinburgh. This is the Peter Wilson lecture, and it's really stems from the work that Peter, who was a very esteemed member of the Royal Society of Edinburgh and served as its General Secretary for many years, but also played a role with the SCRR, which is the Edinburgh Consortium of Environmental Affairs. And it's now the SCRR because it's now a Scottish organisation. So we're thankful to Peter, and his wife and his son are still here. And they come every time to the lecture. It's very nice to see them. And our guest lecturer this evening is Professor Ian Boyd. I'm pleased to say that I've known Ian for many years and we've worked together. He is now the Chief Scientific Advisor to the Department of the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, which is DEFRA, which we know very well as DEFRA. But he remains a Professor of Biology at the University of St Andrews, where he still has an interest in his marine research. And it was through the marine research that I became aware of Ian's work, and we worked together with the Scottish Association for Marine Science, and he was a member of our council and much valued member too. So it's good that he's able to continue that work, because I guess there is a life after the department. Or maybe there is. So that's the background to the lecture. I'm going to ask Ian now to introduce himself and to proceed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sir John, and thank you very much to the Royal Society of Edinburgh for inviting me along here this evening. It's probably about 15 years since I stood at this podium previously, when I had the honour of getting a medal from the Royal Society of Edinburgh called the Bruce Medal for my polar science. And at the meal after that medal was presented, there was a number of individuals there, and I have to be apologetic to probably all of the individuals because I can't remember who was there apart from one individual. It was Peter Wilson. And he really stood out in my mind as somebody who was interested, sort of intelligent, and entertaining as well. And I think he just started his period as General Secretary of the Royal Society of Edinburgh at that time. So I have had contact with Peter in the past and greatly valued the interest he took in what I did. It's probably appropriate that the lecture this evening is on a subject which would have been of particular interest to Peter, because I'm going to be talking about environmental issues and particularly about agricultural issues in a broad strategic sense. I have been recorded to say in the past, and I will say it again, that I think DEFRA is probably the most important department in government. And I say that because governance in civil society, if it has one function to perform, it has to supply food, water and a clean environment to its public. And that's what DEFRA does. There's equivalents in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland as well. But DEFRA has that absolutely central role in government. Other things are important. Defence is important, education is important, health is important. But if you don't supply the absolute basics of life, then you're failing as a government. And one of the central messages I want to try to get over this evening is that sometimes we take some of those basics of life perhaps for granted, and perhaps over the next few decades we're going to be challenged about taking those for granted. So what I want to do through the rest of this talk is give you a general oversight about where I think those challenges sit, particularly with respect to my role within DEFRA as a Chief Scientific Advisor, and then moving to the broad global role that we have as a society and how we might respond to that global role and what our particular sort of research base might be able to do to help global society solve some of its problems. I then want to look at some more detailed examples of where we have specific problems today, and I think some of you might be interested in some of those examples when I get to them. But what I want to do first of all is give you an idea of where I think some of the priorities sit for DEFRA. I've been in that job for 6 months, and basically listed here are what I think some of those priorities are likely to be. We're doing a new evidence investment strategy in DEFRA. I don't want to preempt exactly what it's going to look like, but I don't think it's going to look too much different from what's on the screen here. 3 basic areas of priority. First, food and water security. And I'm going to come back to food security later on. We have to get better at producing high-quality food. We have to find technological solutions. We have to have resilience in our food supply. We have to address the issues of resource limitation, and we have to get better at predicting what the dynamics of our food supply and our water supply are going to be in future. The second is disease. We are very challenged by disease. We have issues particularly around bovine tuberculosis, and I'm going to come back to that later on, but there are other diseases, animal diseases. We have also got tree and plant diseases. Many of you, well, all of you will be aware of the ash dieback problems, but I'm going to come back to just explaining what the level of that challenge is a little later on. And invasive species, which are simply diseases of the environment, and we have to deal with them too. We've also got environmental stress, where air and water quality are vitally important for the quality of the environment that we have to live in. And then about optimizing solutions. In other words, trying to make the best decision under different trade-offs. So we have to be able to understand what the trade-offs are, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about trade-offs later on. And finally, we have to get to environmental productivity. In other words, understanding what the environment can actually do, what the limits are to the capacity, our capacity to actually exploit the environment. We need to do a number of things to deliver on that, and I'm just putting these up initially just to give you an idea of the kind of activities that we have to put in place in an organisation like DEFRA. I have about 3,000 staff to deliver this, and a budget of about £200 million a year, or just a bit below that now, and it's going down, to spend on what we call evidence gathering, basically research. Some of it is surveillance and monitoring, and some of it is research and development. But we want to put in place the absolute best research that we possibly can, and we're striving for excellence across the board. But in this talk, what I want to do is go through a number of different issues. First of all, I'd like to talk a little bit about science and government, how that works. I then want to talk about global stresses, and that's where I'm going to come back to food security as the main focus of global stress. I then want to look at the UK response to building resilience to some of those global stresses and how that can play out in a global context. I'll then have a look at how we deal with environmental management in that context, because there's a trade-off between some of the solutions to global stresses and our own local environment. And then I hope I'll have time to look at a few acute issues, one of which is bovine tuberculosis, tree disease, and pollinators. So let's have a look at science in government, first of all. Well, I, as a scientific advisor, almost in daily contact with ministers, and one gets a very different view of the world from the point of view of looking at it through ministerial eyes. Things happen quickly, and what is shown here is a depiction of the policy cycle, showing movement from a strategic phase through definition of a problem to developing and analysing alternatives, right through the way through to delivery of policy, evaluation, and back again. One of the things that science has to do is find its feet within this cycle. And it can have there's different types of science feed into different parts of the cycle. And this cycle can move at different speeds. It rarely moves faster than slower than a 5-year cycle, but it will often move a lot faster, and it can move on a daily pattern in situations of crisis. But one of the issues about how science feeds into this cycle is whether we have policy-led science or science-led policy. There's a tendency for us to slip into a pattern of having policy-led science. In other words, science that is simply at this end of the policy cycle where evaluation tends to happen. So science is simply sitting in there telling the policy people whether they've got it right or not. What I would like to see us doing is slipping around here to defining the problem and being at this strategic phase. In other words, science actually leading policy and telling us what direction we ought to be going in. And again, that's something that I want to come through this lecture as a basic theme. So we need to understand where science can and can't help. And we need to be honest about how much we can say from our science. Sometimes we cannot actually help a problem because we actually don't have the tools to answer the question, and we have to be honest in saying that. Sometimes when we do have the tools, we come up with an uncertain answer, and we have to be honest about the uncertainties. Sometimes we haven't been honest about the uncertainties in the past, and that has led to bad policy decisions. We make sure that the knowledge is used, and that means that we have to be able to communicate with the users of that knowledge, in other words, those who are developing policy and politicians. We have to know where the problem sits in the policy cycle, so that's what I was saying before about exactly where we actually have a scientific intervention in the policy cycle. And as I said, we need to move from policy-led science to science-led policy. And we have to also understand these scales and rhythms to be able to feed in appropriately. We have certain translational modes for this. I work with government most of the time, but I'm also working with business and with the public. And we need to be able to provide communication through all of those modes because all of those actually influence policy. Through each of these, via business, we need to be able to have innovative supply. We need to shift expectations in the public arena, and we need to inform regulation and leadership within government. All of these things are things that science can influence, and they can lead it to some extent. But when people say that we should have science-based policies, actually what they're really talking about is science-influenced policies. We can't actually dictate what policy should exist based on science alone. So what do I do as a chief scientific advisor? Well, essentially my job description falls into three main categories, or this is the way I would describe it at least. I advise about risk management, and an awful lot about government is about containing and mitigating risk. The risk of making bad decisions, and there can sometimes be long time lags in these bad decisions. It can be time lags from years to decades even. It's about modelling futures, and when I say modelling, that can be anything from formal modelling to informal conceptual modelling. In other words, trying to understand what future scenarios might be, what the plausible worst case might be of a particular set of circumstances. And I'll come back to the plausible worst case perhaps later on about bovine tuberculosis, for example. And we have, what we have to do is also fully parameterize the uncertainties and understand what kind of risks we're dealing with, whether we're dealing with epistemic risks, which are basically risks that we have some information about, or whether we're dealing with the aleatory risks, which are the unknown unknowns that come at you from left of field on occasions and can come out without really much notice. And we've seen a few of those in the 6 months I've been there. There's been ash dieback, there's been floods, which I suppose that's more of an epistemic risk, and there's been horse meat, which is the most recent issue to deal with. We can describe, I also have to try to describe the cost-benefit trade-offs, and I'll come back to pollinators and neonicotinoids later on about a cost-benefit analysis that one has to do in trying to make better decisions, understand where the payoffs sit, and have objective measurement, sorry, there's a spelling mistake there, objective measurement of those payoffs. Finally, what I want to do is try to stimulate innovation. We're not going to get anywhere, we're not going to get through our problems unless we actually have innovative science sitting there with new ideas. I want DEFRA to be funding innovative science, and we'll do that alongside the research councils and other partners if we can. So what are the constraints on trying to do this job? Well, one of the biggest constraints is just communicating complex ideas. And that's communication not just to ministers and other people other civil servants. It's communicating these complex ideas to the public and to business. One of the constraints around communication is just where the limits to the evidence lie. In other words, the limits to scientific knowledge. There is a tendency within government, particularly within the policy spectrum, to be able to say, well, we don't have enough information to be able to make this decision. Let's give it to the scientists, allow them to work on it for a while, and they'll come up with the answer. Well, actually, in environmental issues, we usually don't come up with the answer. We come up with an answer of sorts, but it's often not what the policymakers really want. So when it goes round this rather fruitless cycle of trying to communicate with the policymakers what the limits of the evidence actually are, and what the limits of our capacity to investigate problems might be. There's also what I would call media inadequacies. Trying to communicate complex problems through the media is just hopeless. They have no idea. I think the BBC probably does a pretty good job, but there's probably very few other media outlets that actually communicate complex ideas in a constructive way to the public. And in many cases, they do it destructively. So they'll take one aspect of an idea and they'll build that into a story, and actually it just creates huge amounts of confusion. There's nothing we do about that, but we need to live with it and work around it. There's also an issue around science professionalism. And this is a particular hobby horse of mine because I think that science needs to build a higher professional esteem and a higher understanding of, particularly in individual cases, when people are speaking as scientists as opposed to citizens. In other words, when they're giving professional scientific advice, particularly in the context of media, as opposed to standing up and giving their personal opinion. And sometimes, even with some very senior scientists, they don't make that distinction. And of course, the media never makes that distinction. And it can create confusion in the minds of the public. And then there's, of course, the issue around pseudoscience, which actually blends in with science professionalism. And we've got a lot of people out there saying the scientific facts say this, when in fact they really don't know much about what they're talking about. And sometimes they're actually talking about unverified scientific information. Another issue that's a constraint is what I call market failure. I could talk a lot about market failure, particularly in two ways. There's one type of market failure is the fact that actually we sometimes don't have the scientific expertise we need to solve a problem. And the UK is actually not big enough to contain all the scientific expertise that DEFRA needs. And that's one of the problems I have to deal with, in that UK government would like to spend its money in the UK, but actually some of the best experts, some of the best people are somewhere else in the world. But the other type of market failure is one where, because of regulation, we've actually induced a market failure, and one can talk about that in terms of certain types of chemicals that we use for herbicides and pesticides, for example, but also in terms of drug development for controlling disease. Timescales are another issue. There's something I call the 20-year rule. In other words, if we've got a bright young scientist at the moment with a great idea on the bench, it's going to take at least 20 years to get that into an operational mode out there in the environment. And that's getting longer. And it's getting longer partly because we're actually adding, down here, more regulation to the system. We've also got contrasting values applied to short and long-term timescales. So, it's very difficult to do things with forest health when, in fact, all you can do is work on a 50-plus year time horizon. The public doesn't understand that, so trying to get those ideas over. Genetically modified organisms, 20-plus year time horizons. Bovine TB, if we want to do something about it, it's going to take us 4 decades, But people want solutions tomorrow. And regulation really is at the root of a lot of these problems. And good and bad regulation and good and bad policy can drive some of these constraints. One of the central questions I would ask is, can we persuade people to make decisions now when the payoff is several decades off? And that's one of the biggest problems we have, particularly in environmental science, when things work very slowly and when we have to make very difficult decisions now that actually are a disadvantage to people in the present day, so that people further down the line, several decades down the line, can actually experience an advantage. Now, I want to come back to regulation and give you an example of where I think a problem with regulation lies. And this example I'm going to use is the Habitats and Wild Birds directives, which are EU directives. Many of you might be familiar with them. They really are at the centre of our wildlife legislation in this country. One of their problems is that they sit with what I would call idealised objectives, some of which are not fundamentally based on evidence on ecological processes. They basically want to contain the environment in its current state and maintain it largely in its current state. That may not have been the original intent, but that is the way it's actually being implemented. It's largely precautionary in an old sense rather than a modern sense. Precautionary in a modern sense means that decisions are proportionate, non-discriminatory, and consistent. What we find is non-proportionate decisions being made within this context. They are certainly discriminatory, and they are certainly very inconsistent. We've got lack of recognition of scientific uncertainty within the context of the application of these directives. And this means we have inflexibility, poor fit to social needs, and eventually I think we're going to get policy failure with these directives because I don't think they're going to work. Now, that's a personal view, but I think that they are seriously flawed. And I want to give you an illustration of why I think they're seriously flawed, and this comes back to a piece of economics theory called Kuznets theory. And what Kuznets said was that as income per capita increases, you get increasing environmental degradation on a curve something like this. And then at some point, income per capita becomes high enough that actually people can start reinvesting in the environment in such a way as to reduce degradation, or their GDP is increasing partly because their society is sophisticated enough that they're using materials that don't really impact on the environment very much. Now, there are quite a number of economists out there who disagree with this. Nicholas Stearns is one of them. And what they say is that actually what really happens is that our environmental degradation keeps going up. And all that happens when we get to this point is we get clever enough to export our problems elsewhere. And actually, I think they're right. I think that what tends to happen is that as we get richer, we make space for nature. I've put the title page here up for the Lawton report, which is called Making Space for Nature. And in making space for nature, we don't actually reduce, for example, the amount of food we eat. We still have the same demand on food, but we export that problem elsewhere, possibly to somewhere that is more poorly regulated and has higher environmental impacts. So the Habitats Directive sits in wealthy nations who have the luxury to be able to export their problem elsewhere. We also have the luxury to look down on the others and preach at them, the ones who are somewhere down here in the per capita income, and say, well, you should be doing it like we are, which is pretty tough. And I think we've got to get a little bit more clever about how we deal with that. So we're exporting our environmental footprint. So what I'd like to turn to now is global stress. And before I do so, I just want to preface this by saying that, or by talking a little bit about risk, because everything I say could be wiped out by some of the risks that we face with respect to some of the major problems that we might have from environmental hazards, which are anything from tidal waves to volcanoes. And this is from the UN has produced this risk map. Anything that's pink or red is really very high risk area. You see the UK is pretty low risk, but because of the way that the globe is interconnected now, if any of these things happens out here, it's going to have a pretty severe effect on us as well. And that's because we are integrally networked with the globe. If these things had happened 200 years ago, and actually the hazard has not changed, these are all natural hazards, the hazard has not changed, but the risk is getting greater all the time because we're getting more and more interconnected economically, socially, and in terms of our food supply in particular. So everything I say is predicated on the fact that it could all just be wiped out by some of these major risks happening. And there's a good chance that some of them will happen, perhaps even in my lifetime. I also want to have a pretty sobering message that I would say that sometime between 2030 and 2050, if we don't do anything about it, in other words, if we maintain status quo, we are going to experience in the globe some pretty seriously debilitating conditions, economically, socially, politically, which could result in some civil breakdown in various places. And the reasons for that are sort of listed here. Some of them are very familiar to you. World population, 9 billion by 2050. Decline of available oil. So we're possibly past peak oil now, but nobody quite knows. Aquifer depletion in some of the areas of highest global population. There's a prediction that there will be 1,000 cities the size of Edinburgh in Africa by 2050. Now, that's a pretty big number of cities, and they all need water supplies, and they're all in areas which are water stressed already. There's going to be a rise in extreme climate. We're going to have a shortage of natural resources, and I'll come back to some of that in a minute. And we're going to have increased levels of disease. And one of the things that Sally Davis, the Chief Medical Officer, announced a few weeks ago was that the Department of Health and DEFRA have both put multi-drug resistance on their risk registers. If we don't do anything about it, we're not going to be able to have a hip replacement operation by 2030 because people who have a hip replacement operation will die because we don't have the drugs to treat them. So we've got to make things change. So I want to turn to food security, and I want to turn to food security in three contexts: drivers, constraints, and solutions. And this curve here, which again will be familiar to many of you about showing global commodity prices, is showing a worrying trend. It's a trend upwards. The yellow line is the global commodity price. But it's not just an absolute upward trend in price, it's a relative upward trend. In other words, if you look at raw materials, which is this sort of slightly blue line here, that hasn't changed very much. and the actual commodity price was well below the raw material price, whereas now it's actually above it. So basically, the demand side is driving the commodity price. And I want you to note these peaks here, because they're important in the context of what I'm going to say next. So if we look at the first key driver, population growth, again, very familiar to all of you. I've just said that we're probably going to have about 9 billion people by 2050, but there are confidence limits around that. It might drop off. It might actually drop off quite a lot. But I think some of these scenarios here are fairly apocalyptic scenarios where we have quite significant problems in various parts of the world that cause quite high death rates. But one of the issues that I have found in the research that I have done in the past is that as resource stress hits a population, you get nonlinear responses. This is actually from seals that I worked on, but nevertheless it's been shown in a whole variety of different, particularly higher vertebrates, not dissimilar to humans, that what tends to happen is that for quite a range of, in this case, food availabilities, you get very little change going on, but then things start to drop off very rapidly. And I'll just go back up to the previous diagram, and these spikes are exactly what you would expect with a nonlinear response of that type. So basically, what we're seeing is, with this rise in global population, we're seeing ourselves moving along this part of the curve, and we're beginning to drop off the edge of it. So we shouldn't think that if we are going to have 9 billion people in the world by 2050, that it's just going to be another 15 to 20% added to the current problem. It's going to be a problem that's going to be hugely magnified by this sort of nonlinear effect. Exactly where we are on this is the $9 million question. If we're still well along here, then it's not so much of a problem. But if we're hanging on the edge here, as suggested by the global commodity price, then I think we have a major problem. Added to that, it's not just 9 million people needing more food. As purchasing power increases, food consumption goes up. So as people get richer, we're actually taking more food out of the system, and we eat more meat. So we're becoming ecologically less efficient as well. So that compounds on the number of people in the population to place greater demands on the energy, on the food supply. I've titled this The Prisoner's Dilemma Game because actually we're all enclosed in this globe and we're all trying to get on with each other and we're all in a kind of standoff. And for those of you who know about the Prisoner's Dilemma game, it's always better to cooperate. The payoff is always better to cooperate. But usually what happens is that the players in the game default. In other words, they don't cooperate. And why I've put this up is that I co-chair with a Chinese colleague a UK-China joint initiative in agricultural research. And they send me, on occasions, updates of what's happening in China. And I've just taken some quotes out of this update. By 2020, China would need to import 100 million tons of grain each year. That's 5% of the global production. China and India have to open up to the global markets, like Australia, Africa, Latin America, etc. But when they say this, they actually mean they're going to buy those markets. They're not going to trade them. They're going to actually go out and buy them. And this is shown here. State-owned COFCO, which is a Chinese state-owned conglomerate, acquired Australia's Tully Sugar. COFCO plans to spend more than $10 billion on overseas mergers and acquisitions. The reason they're doing this is to actually secure the food supply for their population. That's actually defaulting from the prisoner's dilemma game. Once China defaults, then nobody else can play the game. It's extraordinarily difficult to play the game. And just as another illustration of this, just 7.7% of global rice production was actually traded last year. Now, of course, rice is used in a subsistence context a lot, but that's a very small amount that gets onto the world market. So when we say that there's a world market there and there's free trade actually in food, that doesn't really count. So there's market failure. Okay, another key driver, I'm not going to spend long on this because I think most of you know the story about climate, but generally everything's getting warmer and there's a warming trend and there's greater variance. So there's the trend, that's just a UK trend, and there's the variance around a particular location in the UK. It's actually Exmoor. But I think that's just because it's near the Met Office, basically. But basically, what we're seeing here is, with a progression through time, we're getting much greater variance here in temperature. This is just in temperature. But, you know, I think the experience of the last 12 months has shown us that there's a huge amount of variance in our climate that we haven't seen in the past. So I hope I don't need to convince this audience that that is a major challenge that we have to face. So I want to move now to some of the key constraints that we face. So that I've defined some of the problems, I want to define some of the constraints. And I'm going to just talk about soils, phosphates, land, fish stocks, and water. You could probably add to that list. But they're pretty basic for life and production. Well, we know amazingly little about soil loss. I'm amazed how little knowledge there is about the degradation of soils. We could be losing soils globally at 10 to 40 times faster than they're being replenished. And data from the UK says that there's overall net loss of soils from the UK. And I was speaking to some academics in Exeter University a few days ago who were saying that, you know, in the southwest, a lot of the agricultural fields that they have there are not going to be cultivable within 10 to 20 years just because of soil loss. We're also losing nitrogen slowly from the system as well. So whether this will actually come about by the 2030, 2050 time period or not, I don't know, but I think in the next few decades we're going to start seeing a reduction in soil productivity, not just within the UK, but elsewhere as well. Phosphates. We can't grow anything without phosphates. Now, we have an excess of phosphates in our soils at the moment, but that might not last. That's just because we've been lacing our soils with phosphates for a very long time. We import all our phosphates. We don't have natural phosphates in the UK, and there are very few sources of phosphates around the world. Morocco is the main source. But this graph shows the kind of future trend for phosphates, and there is a suggestion we might come to peak phosphate production about 2030 to 2040. So once we get over the peak, then the law of supply and demand starts to cut in, and it means that phosphate availability becomes more of a problem. We're also losing phosphates from our soils to some extent as well. So phosphates are a potential constraint. Land is another constraint. This is from a paper by Powell and Lenton, just showing what's potentially going to happen with land. And I think what you want to look at is the dark green line here. There's a lot of more information in here that they gave than this, but the dark green line is more important. And this shows 4 scenarios, one with high meat consumption, because whether you eat meat or chew vegetables makes a big difference or makes some difference. Low efficiency, low meat, low efficiency, high meat, high efficiency, and low meat, high efficiency. And you can see only under certain circumstances do we have a situation where we don't have an increasing demand on land. And in fact, we're up in this space at the moment, and we've really got to get ourselves down here, and that's going to be difficult. Fish stocks. There's about 1 billion people rely, for a major component of their diet, on fish. And this is analysis that I actually did a little while ago, but this looks at the catch per unit effort for global fisheries against time, showing an increase and then basically a sort of a stabilization of catch per unit effort. But one of the problems with this is that this doesn't correct for technology advance. If you actually put in a correction for technology advance, you start getting a rapid reduction in catch per unit effort. And if you were to extrapolate beyond the line, which of course nobody would do, but if you were to do that, you're seeing that actually we're heading towards the zero line pretty rapidly on global fisheries. Water. 70% of water abstracted globally is used for agriculture. These are just some interesting pieces of information. Each person needs about half an Olympic-sized swimming pool of water. That's fresh water, clean water, every year for the food that's produced. There's an interesting statistic here. 2.5% of global water is fresh, and less than 1% of that is usable for ecosystems and people. So there ain't a lot of water in the world that's available to us, and most of the water quality is declining. 70% of industrial waste in developing countries, at least, is dumped. And in addition, as I've already said, some of the areas of greatest population increase are going to be very water stressed. So how do we deal with this? Well, what are the key solutions? Waste reduction. We can do a lot in terms of waste reduction. We've got, there's about 4 billion tons of waste is produced globally each year. But I think the eye-watering statistic is that up to 80% of food that's produced in Southeast Asia is actually wasted. And of course, in different parts of the world, in different countries in different states of development, the wastage happens at different stages in the food chain. In developing countries, most of the wastage happens down here. In the developed countries, it tends to happen up here. And we can do a lot about that, but actually most of the impact is going to happen in the developed countries. But we can help to provide some of the technological solutions to make that happen. Is our own house in order? Well, first of all, the EU has recently gone from self-sufficiency to no longer being self-sufficient. The UK has not been self-sufficient in food for a very long time. This is from 1970 through to 2010. And you can see it's varied a bit, but it's just about 60% self-sufficient in food. We're engaging in global markets, but I've always said that I don't think those global markets probably work very well, certainly not for food. And as self-sufficiency declines, we are declining our self-sufficiency, partly because we're exporting our problem. We've got perverse exclusion of innovative solutions, such as GM and some forms of pesticides. And 15% of what we purchase is wasted in the UK, and that's 60% of our wastage is actually avoidable. So we can actually do a lot to put our own house in order. We can also come up with innovative solutions. So this is where I want to see more funding from ourselves and DEFRA and also the research councils going into this. We want to move to sustainable intensification. We want to design resilience into systems. Genetic selection and genetic modification is going to be important. What I've done here is put up the productivity graph. Sorry, it's quite difficult to see it, but these are the main commodity crops that are produced. We've been very good at pushing these up through time. The only way we're going to maintain these is if we do all the things about maintaining our soils and put into practice some of these solutions. Creating C4 rice, for example, being innovative about putting different types of nutrients into some of the commodity crops as well, like in this case, the case of golden rice, to get better efficiency out of the crops. The other thing that we can do is we can make the average into the best. And this is a particular bugbear of mine, in that what this graph shows is that in the US, the average farmer is only half as good as the best farmer. So my mantra is, if we can turn the average farmer into the best farmer, then we're doing really well. In the UK, however, we could probably achieve an immediate 10% increase in yield if the average adopted the practices of the best 10. Now, that's about education. It's about passing on, it's about identifying innovators, it's about encouraging early adopters of technology and innovation, and it's about leading by example. The other thing, which is a good thing, is that agri-environment schemes tend to be good for farm business. So there are some positive messages for the environment out of this as well. So just looking quickly at the environment, and I want to move on really quickly because I know we're running out of time. One of the major steps forward that my predecessor made was to initiate something called the UK National Ecosystem Assessment. I'm not going to go into this in any great detail, but it's an economic-based assessment process that allows us to develop a system for understanding what the cost-benefit trade-offs are associated with different high-level policy decisions. It gives us the capacity to make better choices. It's a whole system approach. Its approach is to try to maximize ecosystem services rather than to maximize one particular aspect of the system, like food production. It's one of its objectives in the long term is to try and preserve and enhance natural capital. And many of you are aware that we've set up the Natural Capital Committee that is now advising the Treasury on how to incorporate that into the measures of gross domestic product. So we may come up with a new system for understanding how rich we are, not just based on how much money we've got, but how much natural resource we also have as well. Just one of the outputs from this, comparing two different scenarios. The National Ecosystem Assessment ran several scenarios, and what this is showing is two of those scenarios, one that's called nature at work, in other words, a policy decision that tends to drive towards favouring natural processes within the system, and the other one allowing world markets to dictate what we do. And here's some of the measures. There's change in agricultural values, change in greenhouse gas emissions, change in recreational value, change in urban green space, and the biodiversity index. The greener it is, I guess the better it is. And if you just cast your eyes along here, as opposed to here, nature at work looks a lot better. The only problem is that actually world markets here are probably what's going to dictate. In other words, the economics are going to dictate more strongly than some of these other measures because of what I've said before about food security issues. So my suspicion is that even though the nature at work scenario looks better, it's going to be driven by a weighted average, which is going to be around the economics of farming. So what this illustrates is the trade-off we're going to have to potentially endure, or the decision we're going to have to make about what trade-off we want between essentially a green ecosystem and a red one, which is down here. And the trade-off is, do we want to eat, or do we want, well, that's probably a bit too extreme, but I mean, I will be extreme because it's just an easy way of illustrating it. Do we want to eat, or do we want a beautiful green natural environment? And of course, there's a spectrum there, and we can sit somewhere in the middle of that spectrum. But how do we make those choices? Okay, I just want to pass on to some of the acute issues that I've had to deal with in the last few months. And I'm sure this will be of interest to some of you. Bovine tuberculosis. It's a big problem for us. Some of the future scenarios, I was talking about the most plausible worst-case scenarios that people like me are responsible for thinking about. We have to think and plan for the worst case. The most plausible worst case with bovine tuberculosis is not pleasant. I won't go into the details of it, but the reality is that it's a bacterial disease, mainly of cattle, which does get into wildlife, particularly badgers, but it does infect humans as well. It doesn't at the moment, but it could. And it's increasing in its prevalence. The sad thing is that we managed to get it under control around about the early 1980s. And we had it under control right through the 1980s, and then we let it go again in the 1990s. Exactly why we let it go isn't clear. There's all sorts of theories. It could be intensification of agriculture. It could be changing trading behavior by farmers. A number of different things. Even some people have said, well, we actually protected badgers down here as well. So, that's just another of the correlations with this increase. But basically, we've lost control of bovine tuberculosis, and we need to get it under control pretty quickly. Just to show you again the pattern, this shows how difficult a problem it is. This is the increase up until foot and mouth disease hit, when all testing was stopped. We test huge numbers of cattle each year. We cull about 24,000 cattle every year because they've got bovine tuberculosis. And we still have a 10% increase per year. But this shows you the kind of increase you would get if we stopped testing. So basically, it would just go straight up through the roof very quickly. So the current controls work up to a point, but they don't stop the increase. Those are very stringent controls, and there's movement controls on farms that are at high risk. It costs $100 million a year just to put that control strategy in place. And there's about 10 to 20% of herds in England and Wales are actually infected by it at the moment, and that's going to go on increasing. So what I want to do is look at the control strategy that we have. First of all, tuberculin testing, then vaccination, biosecurity, and then wildlife control. Tuberculin testing is what we do already. As I said, 24,000 cattle with TB slaughtered every year, although somebody told me today it had gone up to 40,000, but I wouldn't like to guarantee that figure. This has been extraordinarily successful. Although what we have done in the meantime is we've exported our brand of tuberculosis all around the world, because we've had trading partners all around the world that we've exported cattle to. And we have a particular genetic type of tuberculosis in the UK, which doesn't occur in France or Spain or the rest of Europe, but does occur around in all our trading partners. So we can actually identify the particular genetic type of tuberculosis there is. And we can identify even the genetic type down to particular areas. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But this has been extraordinarily successful in actually eliminating the strain of tuberculosis that is tested for. It's a strain called SB5. And that is now extinct. So we've managed to make that strain completely extinct. But the strain that we have is something called SB01401, I think it is. And that's almost entirely the strain that occurs within the UK now. We also use a herd test, but we should probably use it as an individual control test. And if we were going to actually really bear down on this, we'd actually take out whole herds as a result of tuberculosis coming in. So there are options for increasing tuberculin testing, but they would be pretty tough on farmers. One of the interesting things about this pattern, where we get particular genotypes spread around the main TB area, which is shown in brown here, is that even though cattle move around, the type of tuberculosis doesn't move with it. And one of the theories behind this is that actually this is a type of tuberculosis that has actually adapted specifically to badger populations and is resident within badgers, doesn't kill badgers, but does kill cattle when it gets into cattle. So there's, this may be representative of badger populations rather than cattle populations. Vaccination. I was at a meeting this morning talking about BCG vaccination. It's about 60% effective. We'd love to vaccinate cattle. But the problem is, as soon as you vaccinate cattle, your tuberculin test becomes invalid, and we could not then trade our cattle within the EU. So that's a big problem. So we have to find an alternative to tuberculin test, and we have to do a field trial of BCG, and that's going to take 10 years to put in place. From today, the minimum time it will take is 10 years to get a BCG vaccine for cattle. We also vaccinate badgers, but it's not really an economical prospect. Biosecurity, one of the best things we could do is to reduce the frequency of contact between infected wildlife and susceptible hosts, in other words, susceptible cattle. So one of the things we can do is vaccinate cattle, but also keep badgers away from cattle. And there's some quite critical controls are being put in place to try and do that. But the trouble is we don't know the route of infection at the moment. There could even be an intermediate between badgers and cattle, for all we know. Or it could be that bovine tuberculosis is very resilient and sits in the environment for long periods of time and reinfects from the environment. And finally, wildlife control, which is the big controversial issue. The Secretary of State has made it absolutely clear that DEFRA is going to go ahead with 2 pilot control culls in small areas within England this year. The evidence says that control of wildlife reservoirs, particularly in US, New Zealand and Australia, is essential if you're going to control TB in cattle herds. There's very high certainty that badgers are the main reservoir for TB in wildlife. There's no doubt about that at all. Genetic analysis shows that very clearly, and genetic analysis also shows the transmission between badgers and cattle. The mode of transmission, I said, is uncertain. But the removal of badgers is a very, very blunt instrument for solving the problem. And we have tested the problem through something called the RBCT trial that cost £50 million to put in place. So we have a pretty good idea what the effect is going to be. But the best effect we'll get is about 16% decline in cattle TB after 4 years. Now that's not much. But you have to see these things in the context of the whole strategy. If we have the status quo, then this is the kind of trajectory we'll get of the number of herd breakdowns in bovine TB. It will just keep on increasing. If you add in wildlife control, in other words, badger culling, and make that reasonably widespread, then you get this sort of effect. If you add in biosecurity, then you manage actually to cause the incidence of TB to start declining. If you add in vaccination, once we're able to get a vaccine in place, which is at least 10 years down the road, then you start to get it under control. So what we need is all of those controls to be put in place to get this difficult disease under control. I just want to spend a very short time on tree disease because this illustrates an interesting problem for us. We have increasing tree disease pressure in the UK. This is year here against the number of outbreaks of tree disease. The curve A, the red one, is including a group of diseases called Phytophthora. B is all other diseases. So you can see that these Phytophthora diseases are starting to become really important. It's the direct effect of international trade. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But the problem is that international trade is much more valuable to us than the costs of tree disease. So we're not going to stop international trade, and we're not going to stop tree disease. We can do our best to stop it, and we will do our best to stop it, but we are going to continue getting tree diseases into the UK. Although one has to put that in context, because we have more trees in the UK now than since the middle of the 15th century. So, although many of them are conifers, obviously, you have to see it in that context. But the problem with tree disease and with the ash dieback issue was one more about the issues that we have to deal with around what we call social amplification. In other words, there's a problem occurs, and it's just another problem. I mean, this has been happening for ages, and these Phytophthora pathogens are a real problem. I mean, ash dieback's a real problem, but they are a real problem. And yet, we didn't get public outcry when we got Phytophthora in. And there's other things like Dothostroma, oak processionary moth, these sorts of things as well. Something happened to amplify ash dieback. Permanent Secretary said to me in the middle of the ash dieback disease, "I'm glad we're not killing badgers at the moment, that would just be terrible." But I said, actually, if we were killing badgers, we wouldn't have an ash dieback problem, because I don't think you would have had social amplification. It would just have been another of the Phytophthora things. So we see seed tree disease as a serious issue, but as I said, we need to see it in the broader context, and we need to see it as something that, yes, we've got to try and control it, but there may be limits to what we can do to control it. I want to finish off with pollinators, because this is a very topical issue, and actually I'm sitting in front of the Environmental Audit Committee of the House and Commons next Wednesday, if anybody wants to log in and have a look at me being grilled on this issue. We assume there are declines in pollinators. There is some evidence of declines in pollinators, and certainly evidence of a reduced in diversity of pollinators. There is less evidence for an absolute decline in pollinator numbers. But of course, lack of evidence doesn't mean lack of effect, so there may well be a decline in pollinator numbers. Bumblebees are beginning to become an iconic species, particularly amongst some of the NGOs, where they are trying to drive an agenda which is actually about how we treat our countryside and how we use pesticides within the countryside. And the focus of this is this group of pesticides called neonicotinoids. This is one for interest. Neonicotinoid pesticides, which they would like us to ban. And the European Commission was going to meet on Monday to put it to a vote. They've decided not to for reasons that we're not quite sure about. But the reality is that there's a lot of pressure on banning these neonicotinoids. However, there is actually quite poor evidence for any effects of neonicotinoids on bees. There is laboratory evidence, but these neonicotinoids are designed to be neurotoxins. They are neurotoxins for insects. So evidentially, they will have a negative effect on insects. And if you give it to insects, they will behave abnormally or they'll die. So in the laboratory, the experiments back that up, but that's not really particularly surprising. The real question is, if they're applied in a field situation, particularly to oilseed rape, where they are particularly important, do they have a significant effect on bee populations? And the answer to that is that we're not quite sure, but all the experiments we've done so far suggest that if there is any effect, it's really quite small. Okay? Now, it might be that we could be criticised for not having looked hard enough, but there comes a point where you're testing a null hypothesis and eventually you've just got to walk away from it, because you could go on testing it forever and ever until you find that effect. But is that effect significant? So one of the lessons is that we need to build a risk-based approach to environmental assessment from this. But there are some clear trade-offs here. So if I can just sort of give you an idea of where I sit on this, and this is just to finish off. Clearly, bees are being used by NGOs as single-issue iconic species in this particular case, where, as I said, we have a relatively poor evidence base to support their case, or they have a poor evidence base to support their case. However, the cost of withdrawal of neonicotinoids is about £400 million to the farming industry each year. So that's roughly what we think it might cost. So there's a big cost associated with taking away neonicotinoids, and there aren't very many other replacements, And in addition, if I come back to my comments about market failure, if we ban neonicotinoids, and some of them have only been in place for a few years, companies are not going to invest their money in developing new and better chemicals. So we end up with a market failure, we end up with no chemicals, and we end up with a declining agricultural production. And in the context of all I've said about food security, that's not a good thing to have. We also tend to export the problem. In other words, if we reduce our productivity here, we don't stop needing the products. We just import them from somewhere else that's probably using neonicotinoids anyway, and probably not using them in as regulated a way as we do. But there's still a finite chance that the NGOs are right. Maybe these neonicotinoids are causing problems, and we just haven't been able to carry out the experiments in the rather messy situation of the field environment that we're faced with. So I'll leave you with one thought. How would you advise the Minister? Thank you very much. All right. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Ian took up this job 6 months ago. This is, I think he's given a really quite remarkable overall view of the task of the advisor, the chief advisor within DEFRA, and fascinating it was indeed. The other thing I think we should just bear in mind as a reality check is that many of the timescales that Ian was talking about range up to about 2050, 2070. For children who are born today, they will be 57 years of age in 2070 and 37 years of age in 2050. So by the time they get to their 40s and 60s, their individual welfare and the family's welfare may be well stressed by these. So this is a reality check on the importance of this. Coming down to the last thing you said, which is that you're going to be examined by the Parliamentary Committee on Wednesday, did you say?
Wednesday, yeah.
And the European Parliament has delayed its vote for some unrecognised reason, which is to watch what he's going to say on Wednesday. So we're now going to have questions. Please keep them short, and we'll do our best to answer them. Yes, here's the first question. And there are microphones coming, and please give your name. And make the question short. Thank you.
Hello, yeah. My name's Mike Coffey from the Scottish Rural College, and I was a bit surprised that you didn't mention genetic selection for resistance to TB as one of your options for control.
I mean, I would just say it's in there with the with all the options. I would have said that it probably sits in the large basket of measures that I sort of generally block up as biosecurity. This is more about messaging, and giving 4 messages rather than 6 or 8 messages is a lot easier. What I would say is that genetic resistance is part of the story. I think there's, in fact, I just saw a very interesting paper about that just about last week, actually. Genetic resistance in Holstein cattle, which is suggesting that there is quite a variation in their susceptibility to TB. Interestingly, having spoken to some of the representatives of the farming industry, they have already factored that into quite a lot of what they do in a very informal way. So they're ahead of the science in this to some extent. I'm going to sort of broaden your question out a little bit, because one of the interesting things about managing bovine TB is about how to manage people as well. And I think there's a partial answer to bovine TB by addressing the question of why do 40% of farms that are in the high bovine TB areas never get bovine TB? Is it because they've got genetically resistant herds, or is it because the farmers are doing something different? we've never been able to analyse that to the extent of finding, one or two particular characteristics. But now that we've got a bit of a handle on genetic resistance, it might help us at least eliminate one of those or find a possible answer. The other way to approach that is to actually withdraw quite a lot of the support we give to farmers and say, actually, we're going to leave it up to you to copy. I mentioned earlier on the innovators and the copiers. If those who don't get TB are the innovators, the others around them will copy them pretty quickly if they don't get support. So there's a social side to this as well.
Next question. Down in the front here.
Professor Tony Trewavas, there's a very interesting article in this week's Nature by Lynn Dix, whose name you probably know, on this precise question of pollinators, and pointing out that the EU has received 1.5 million email messages to save the bee from extinction. Now, if the EU decides to ban neonicotinoids, can we resist that ban in this country?
Technically, no. So there's a real problem here in that the EU is proceeding down a path which, in our view, is not evidence-based. What we hope is that they've actually stopped for a moment to think about this. They're obviously responding to the pressure that is coming in, and understandably so. But we think it would be a disaster, not just for the UK, but for the EU, if these were withdrawn. And actually, I don't think it'd be a disaster for bees. The problem with bees, if there is a problem with bees, and I think there probably is a problem with bees, it's not because of neonicotinoids. That's a single issue. It's about changing environments, it's about intensification, it's about changing climate, it's about all those sorts of things. And disease. Well, I don't know about bumblebees, certainly honeybees. Disease is a big major issue. So it's a multifactorial problem. And just banning neonicotinoids is not going to solve that problem at all.
Thank you for that question. It's an indication of the influence that public pressure can have. The next one is here.
Alistair Guild, what part do the supermarkets play in shaping food and agricultural policy?
Well, it's hard for me to answer that because that's certainly outside my remit within DEFRA. I think that DEFRA is continually interacting with industry in all its forms, right the way along the food chain, right from the producers to the supermarkets at the end of the food chain. But I think there's a very positive relationship, and actually the events of the last few weeks have brought DEFRA and the supermarkets together very constructively, actually, despite maybe what sometimes you hear in the newspapers. And actually I think that's going to have very positive ramifications in future for quality control and the kind of relationship that does exist between ourselves and the supermarkets.
Question in the centre.
Thank you. I'm Douglas Hall. I'm just a punter who's very interested and somewhat depressed by your agenda there. But what we've talked about pollinators, genetically modified foods, and so on and so forth. It seems to me there's an uncertainty factor in all of these. One of the other elements is the population growth. So I wonder what's your probability that at some point there must be some control over population, and that, as per China, at some point in the future, the UK will have to put a limit on family size?
I'm not going to answer that one. That's for the Department of Health. Sorry, that's a cop-out.
Next week's lecture and next week.
That's right.
And here.
Roger Crofts. Ian,
Hi, Roger.
you've proved why DEFRA appointed you. It's great to have such a top-level scientist. I want to go back to this dilemma of policy-led science or science-led policy. You've got 3 years, you'll have umpteen secretaries of state, you've talked about long time scales. What's your plan to try and switch that mindset from the policy-led to the science-led?
Well, yeah, it's to be persuasive for a start, but we're actually starting with a clean sheet. We're starting with a completely new evidence strategy, and while I can't say exactly how that's going to come out, I think that quite a significant part of the expenditure that we're going to be allocating to research in DEFRA is going to be, for example, partnered with the research councils to try and do more strategic research to understand why we get problems like ash dieback, like pollinators, or problems with pollinators, and try to nip them in the bud many years before they actually get there. And I'll come to, in response to that, I'll come to one of the reasons why I think we are where we are with bees and pollinators. And I think it's because there's a lack of trust in the way that government has, successive governments over many, many years have managed the use of chemicals in the agri-environment. And I think it's still not right. But I think it's for scientists to do the research to find out, well, how do we manage it? And if we'd been doing that in the mid-1990s, then we might not be in the position we are right now with pollinators and bees. I think we probably use more chemicals than we need to, but I don't know that for sure. I would like that researched, and I would like to come up with real solutions to that in the long term, rather than just trying to firefight these individual issues.
And you could extend that to things like control in relation to fish farming and so on.
Absolutely,
right.
yeah.
Right, next question. Centre.
Hi, Maggie.
Hi. Thank you for introducing me. I'll give my surname, Maggie Gill. It actually follows on very well from that, because what I was going to ask was about, I really liked your comment earlier in the lecture about looking ahead, and you've just emphasised that again here, and trying to see problems before they came up. And what I was going to ask was, who do you see as your natural partners for that? You mentioned the research councils, but you haven't mentioned other government departments. And also your earlier talk about Europe suggests that perhaps Europe is not the place to go, but it would seem that if we're looking at risks into the future, looking at them on a European-wide level might be a way to go.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've mentioned the Research Council a couple of times, but there's obviously a lot of strategic. There's the James Hutton, which is basically sitting next to you, and a number of other major institutions. But you're right that I don't think it's just even Europe. I think it's global. We need to get better global partnerships in the science area. But if I can go back to the sort of prisoner's dilemma issue around particularly Europe, I think we can partially solve the prisoner's dilemma by dealing on a European scale, and that's why I think Europe is really important to this solution. If we start to get a default situation within Europe, then I think we really are in a very, very bad position. And if we continually get these types of decisions, which are not evidence-based, hazard-based decisions out of the European Commission on things like bees and pollinators, then we will get more countries wanting to default from the European structure. And I think that would be very bad, because I think as a bloc, Europe can actually be potentially self-sufficient from a food perspective. It can trade wildlife, it can trade food, etc., internally, and do that quite successfully. But it can also, it's also probably got the research strengths at that scale to be able to support itself without necessarily relying outside. But certainly we want to be commissioning research really at a European level rather than just at a UK level.
Can I ask the audience, how many of you have actually played Prisoner's Dilemma? When I became principal at Strathclyde University, my chairman of court had a great idea. We would go away for an away day, an away evening, away night, and we would play Prisoner's Dilemma. And we would divide the two leadership teams within the university into the two teams. This started at 10 o'clock after a couple of whiskies. At 3 o'clock in the morning, neither side was communicating with any of the others, and were sworn that they would not move until the other side actually communicated. Chairman of court finally at 4 o'clock gave up and went to bed. So Prisoner's Dilemma has its limitations. Yes, next question.
Donald Bruce. I used to be directing the Society, Religion and Technology project at the Church of Scotland many years ago, now running my own consultancy. You mentioned about whether Europe could be potentially self-sufficient again in food, having just stopped being. Should the UK look to becoming self-sufficient, and in which particular areas would it be most important that it was, and which particular areas is it not really very important?
I'm not sure UK can be self-sufficient, just simply because with our current dietary preferences, we require much more than we're able to grow within our climate regime. Okay, so we can't really be self-sufficient. But if you're talking about, say, having a balanced portfolio, in other words, the calories we export are the same as the calories we import, sort of idea. I mean, in an ideal world, we might want to try to do that, but I think so long as we're part of the European structure, we don't necessarily have to do it, because that's, we're playing a cooperative game there, and at the moment it's working, and we should try to keep it working. But when it comes down to food security, the security part of it is a political judgment about whether that's going to keep going in the long term when the stress really comes on. And I would say that that's doubtful, actually, if when the stress comes on, that the European structure will be able to hold its own. But that's just my take on it. I think and that's me as a citizen just making my judgment. I don't have evidence for that, but when the going gets tough, people look after their own, basically. And we're probably going to have to think a little bit more about that within the UK.
But to what extent, Ian, do you find that European colleagues have the same kind of forward look risk assessment that you've just described to us?
Well, some of them do. Most of them don't have the equivalence of chief scientific advisors at all within their countries. And it's amazing how little science and evidence is actually fed into some of the major policy decisions that are made, particularly about food and agriculture. For example, France is absolutely 100% behind banning neonicotinoids, and yet their agriculture relies on it probably more than ours does. Now, that's a purely political decision based on public opinion. We can't understand it, because if they listened to their scientists, they would be getting a very strong message that actually this probably isn't such a good idea.
Next question. Yes?
Will copies of this amazing talk be available?
Yes. I was going to tell you that a recording of this talk, an edited recording of the talk, will be on the website. And those who have registered by email for this lecture will actually get a summary of the lecture. So, and I presume on the website we'll have the slides as well, although there are quite a few of them. Yes, the next question towards the back.
Isla Browning, retired potato pathologist.
Very valuable person, I have to say.
I'm wondering where you see organic agriculture fitting into the future
That's a good point.
picture.
Well, organic agriculture, has its place, but I think it's pretty clear that we couldn't go completely organic. You know, at the moment, that's just really not on the cards. Organic agriculture is not as productive as other forms of intensive agriculture. But you know, I did put a notice up there saying that agri-environment schemes actually work. They're good for business. And what tends to be good for business tends to be good for productivity at the end of the day. So I think that we need to look at an intelligent mixture of the kind of agricultural systems that we have. And in certain circumstances, organic is going to be a very good thing to have, and in others, it's not going to be a very sensible thing to have. But we can't do organic everywhere, that's for sure.
Right. Yes.
Brian Harrison, Hutton Associate. Not only are we trading goods with Europe, especially, but we're trading diseases with them now. Mm-hmm. So they come along with the goods. And this seems to go along with decreasing inspections of products when they're being traded. We hear staff are cut here, there, and everywhere, not only in plant diseases, but also in animal inspections. So that means we have to not think about controlling these things, but managing them. Is that your approach now to looking at diseases? So we must reckon to have every disease there is in Europe before long, and finding a way of managing it.
I think you've summed that up very well, yes. We can't stop these things coming in. We can reduce the probability to some extent. Mm-hmm. But what we're going to have to do is build resilience into our woodland and agricultural systems to be able to cope with this. Now, what resilience will look like is kind of difficult, but again, that's a basic research problem that we need to give to BBSRC or to others who are interested to deal with, because it's not just about the biology of how you design woodlands and how you design agricultural systems. It's about the sociology, about how you get people to engage with that as well. And one of the most difficult things at the moment is to convince people that actually ash dieback or some equivalent of it is going to happen again. You know, I don't know when, but we should expect something like that to happen at least once every 10 years, or probably much more frequently if you believe that graph that I put up. So, you know, we've got to manage expectations, but we've got to come up with systems that will provide greater resilience.
A lady in the centre here.
Hello, my name is Barbara Stütz. I was wondering how important you find to give more research funding to agroecological research or organic research, because I think one reason for organic not producing as much output as conventional farming is also because there has not been a lot of research money going into this field. And so agroecology in terms of looking at whole farm approaches rather than only components on the farm, and trying to close nutrient cycles, etc., given the reality of reduced resources and
I mean, I think that's a very good point. And you know, we in a sense, we probably are trying to converge the intensive agriculture with the organic approach. We're just about to publish an adaptation plan for the use of pesticides, for example, and on the back of that, we intend to introduce measures that will try to make, you know, the large sort of farmers, intensive farmers, think a bit more like the organic farmers do, using integrated pest management schemes, using risk-based approaches to managing their systems. That's still a long way from where organic farming actually is. And I think you're right. Maybe we should be trying to put more money into organic farming, make it more productive, make it, if you like, bring it towards where intensive farming is, but also bring intensive farming much more towards where organic farming is. They'll never join up, but we can get them a lot closer than they are now.
I'm going to take another 3 questions because Ian's had a long journey. He's given a very detailed talk and he's answering questions very well, but we have to let him have a rest at some stage. So 3 more questions, please. One in the centre here.
Jack Matthews, retired marine ecologist.
Just a second, the microphone's coming. If you just repeat your name.
Yes, Jack Matthews, retired marine scientist. So my knowledge of terrestrial ecology is not as up to date as it might be. But I think my question relates to the opinion of a forebear of yours, a predecessor of yours, Krebs, who reckoned that the idea of a cull for badgers was scientifically somewhat flawed. And looking at your diagram of the effective means of controlling, it appeared that vaccination was the only one which worked. And it had little deviation from the other curves. Would it not be, given the fact that the real controversy, public controversy over the badger control lay in the selective cull, would it not be better to put all our research effort into the vaccination approach and avoid the further controversy of the cull, which seemed to lead to the general public appearance of the fact that DEFRA's policy is not science-led?
Well, I'll address the issues raised by Lord Krebs. What he was basically saying was that he agreed with the figures I put up there, which is basically we can expect a 16% reduction in bovine TB from the increased level within 4 years. What he is saying is that that's actually not enough to justify the costs involved. Now that's a personal view. I think that if you put that within the context of the strategy, in other words, it's about continuing to bear down on disease in cattle, it's continuing to strengthen biosecurity, maybe looking at things like selective breeding, for example, and it's continuing to develop vaccination, but with wildlife control as part of it, and that was the reason for my diagram. The diagram was a composite of all those measures. I don't think that if you just vaccinated, you would solve the problem, because actually you would leave the wildlife reservoir intact and it would simply reinfect, and you'd have a continuous process of reinfection. And BCG is not a perfect vaccine by a long way. So there aren't really many other options than to go for the whole lot. This is a really serious disease, and I just don't think you can pull any punches with it at all. And if we continue to pull our punches, we will end up in a pretty seriously difficult position, to be honest.
Another question, the centre.
Thank you, Ian Gordon. Much of what you've talked about, I think you've done a very good job of shifting the emphasis away from the problem towards what are the solutions to those problems, and I think that's the way we have to go. The issue is that the solutions are still hypotheses, in effect, and as scientists we should be saying we should test these hypotheses out in the real world. Do you think ministers have both an understanding of that the scientific method has to be applied to the testing of those hypotheses in the real world, or an appetite for it?
Interesting question. I think ministers do have an appetite for that. All the ministers I interact with, now that doesn't mean that all ministers are like this, but all the ministers I interact with are very well, want their decisions to be evidence-led. Okay, so they want them to be evidence-based. And anything that will supply that evidence is something that they're interested in. You're right that a lot are hypotheses, and I think one of the things that I find quite frustrating with my scientific colleagues is that if we have a particular problem, they want to be able to take that problem away, do an experiment, come up with a solution and deliver that solution. Actually, we've got to do the experiments in the operational environment. So we've got to do what I call risk-based adaptive management. And that's actually doing the experiment in reality. And in a sense, you know, that's what we're doing most of the time. We're learning, we're coming up with a hypothesis, we're saying, let's put a policy in place that does this. We do it, we review it, we say it worked or it didn't work, and we adjust it and we move on. And eventually you converge, hopefully, on a decent solution. If we do it any other way, it just won't happen.
Last question.
Phil Thomas. I'm intrigued in the way that, as is often the case, the food security issue is portrayed as something that's in the future. We all tend to do it. Mm. But the reality is the food security issue is with us now, because if you look at the bottom 25% of the income profile, you already have problems of food security beginning to emerge. Yeah. And the question I was wanting to ask you is, how can you put that, how might you put that into a political dimension that actually gets the politicians to recognize that this is not something that's away in the future, it's something that's very immediate?
Well, first of all, I agree with you, and that was the reason for my explanation about the commodity price spikes and that sort of thing. You know, it's with us now. Putting it in political context, it's enormously difficult because the politicians spend 99.9% of their time looking to the next 24 hours, or if, you know, maybe to the next week, but it's usually the next 24, 48 hours, let alone, you know, 10 years down the road, or 20 years down the road. But what I can assure you is that I do have conversations like this with people like the Secretary of State, you know. So I'm going to Australia and New Zealand with them. I'll be traveling with them through that time, and I will be passing on these sorts of messages. And I think that's the only way I can think of really doing it, apart from making sure that I pass on the message to people like you, and you recycle it through the system that comes back to them in other directions as well. And I know, Phil, that you're very adept at doing that with ministers in various different ways.
I think we've had a very, very interesting question time. I think the ministers are pretty privileged to have a chief scientific advisor of this quality.